Oh, okay, yeah.
Right. Let me briefly introduce our next speaker. Professor Stols-Witlox is Professor of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies, as well as Scientific Director at CWTS at Leiden University. What I forgot to mention earlier is that today's project, so Replication in Humanities, is embedded in a larger project in epistemic progress in the university, funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. You've seen the logo a couple of times on the PowerPoint presentations. And as such, we've also cooperated with your research center in the current project. Something that not a lot of people know about Stols-Witlox is that when her father passed away last year, Sarah became the curator or keeper of her father's artistic legacy, which is a small subset of a much larger collection of paintings, watercolors, and etchings he made as a professional artist over the past decades. I would love to see a bit of that, but first the presentation.
The next time.
The next time. Well, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's actually a nice bridge into the talk, and also thank you for indulging me, and especially because I haven't been as participatory as I want to be because of those circumstances. But when I was invited to join the advisory team for Charlie's projects, that was actually an interesting kind of coming together of two things I like very much to think about. So to experience the world of art and the workings of science. And it's also great, as we were talking about, Stephanie, over the break, that the team invites skeptics, and that's very clear for today's constitution of the group here too. So I'm going to give a talk not on the papers that have already been written, but on a paper I'm preparing with two colleagues from Maastricht University, here on the slide. And that also has been a bit delayed due to the circumstances. And also today has made very clear that we have a lot of homework still to do. And coincidentally, I received an email from Bart, from one of my co-authors, who wrote, "Sarah, this book chapter seems very relevant to us. Does the University Leiden perhaps have access to Professor Brooks, the parallel between scientific and religious?" So that's also a disclaimer. I am an expert in science studies, and particularly in governance of science, and how evaluation and other forms of governance like funding, how they affect scientific practices. So I don't have a lot of knowledge about 16th or 17th century interactions between scholarly and religious and political realms. But we do, as you will notice in the talk, do a playful comparison between the current scientific reform movement, of which reproducibility and the entire discussion around that is a part, and Protestant reforms. Okay, that said, let's get to it. So this hopefully will be part of a special issue on the consequences of the scientific reform movement. So one of the things we try to problematize in the paper we're writing is the and the singular. So we think there are multiple forms of reform circling around. But this entire project is thinking about reproducibility and replicability that actually started with the discussion with Dick and with Lex. It feels like much longer than 5 years ago, but I guess it was 5 years ago, about how to do quality control in the humanities. And we, Bart Penders and I, wrote a commentary for Nature. We didn't come up with this title ourselves. We got a lot of interesting feedback on social media. Some people got very upset. But the point was, all the things we're discussing today, that was, I think, the start of those types of discussions. And ever since 2018 and now, I think a lot has happened and a lot more subtlety has come into thinking about these issues. It was a very short commentary. We tried to push back against the institutionalization of replication in a very unidimensional sense, when you look at how it was proposed to be implemented in policies. And then we pursued this work in a follow-up paper, or a couple of follow-up papers with Bart Penders and with Britt Holbrook, in which we zoomed out to reflect on what has become known as the replicability crisis, in which we focus on measures and policies, again, being implemented nationally and regionally, based on what we think is a restricted and rather uniform conceptualization of what science is and how knowledge is made in different fields. So in this article, we reflect on a fault line that we think runs through the whole academic knowledge making. So from the humanities to social sciences to sciences, grounded in the relationship between writing and research. So separating research as reporting from research as writing. And there we claim that assessment and improvement of quality invites various tools and strategies. And among those, replication is certainly important, but we think it's very important to put these and other tools and strategies in context in order to also situate, assess the value of replication for knowledge making as a whole. But I'm not going to talk about those papers, as I said. In this new piece with Bart and Mare from Maastricht, our starting point was that we wanted to zoom out even further. So this is a really meta conversation, and to reflect on the very phenomenon of reform debates in science currently. So if we take the move to open science, for instance, I'm very interested in analyzing the foundational and also sometimes really polemic framings of open science, as for instance, unlimited and fundamentally good, non-discriminatory, and to compare that with also alternative views about openness as more relational or situated. Good for some, but not for everyone. So what we're trying to do in this article is to argue that reform movements need to make their moral programs visible and also legitimize why certain values deserve priority. And to support that reflection on moral programs, we then do this playful comparison with the moral programs of the reform movement in science with that of the Protestant Reformation. And I say playful because it's absolutely not meant as a full-blown scholarly, well thought through analysis of empirical similarities. What it envisions to do is that it draws out the fact that these reform movements can have also today various moral components, and that moral diversity is also being conflated when people talk about the scientific reform movement. And it's important because these moral programs play a very important role in shaping science, and different moral programs also offer different solutions for supporting credible or reliable or fair or equitable science. And yes, to be very clear, our goal is also, with the previous papers as well, it's also a bit normative. Because we really think that having these conversations and making explicit these moral programs will also allow us to determine when and where which program would serve the purpose best. Now here I'm treading very dangerous ground, so I'm not going to do that. Suffice to say that that's what we realize, and especially with an expert like Mare on board, some of you may know her. This was a new contact for me. It's Bart's colleague. that, well, especially in these kind of big historical accounts of the Reformation, they often start with the publication of Luther's 95 Theses, but many in the room have much more expertise on this. His critique of practices of corruption and exploitation by church officials was, of course, a continuation of existing reform attempts and part of a larger emerging moral indignation about the abuse of power and the search for renewed moral foundations, and also rigor in matters of religion, politics, and apparently also this interaction with scholarly debates. What's interesting for our purposes is also that led to different institutions of discipline and oversight in Calvinist and Lutheran and Catholic territories. So in this very small section of the paper that Maartje is writing, I think one of the things that we're trying to make use of for the contemporary analysis is the fact that there was this big family of Reformed churches sharing but also varying in their morals and also in their, as you could say, call it maybe even surveillance instruments. That's important for the arguments about the plurality of scientific reform movements today. And I guess I've also learned this morning about the plurality of interactions between scholarly and religious and political realms back then. On to scientific reform, the beginning of this comparison, as you would say. That obviously has very prominent spokespersons. This is, for people who recognize him, John Ioannidis, who wrote about research waste in biomedicine. They can be seen as proponents of a very specific approach to doing science, to doing what's morally right in science. These debates aren't new either. They obviously have for centuries scientists have considered and written about behaviors and also structures and pressures and about dominant values in science. Charles Babbage in 1830, he already wrote about the decline of science in England. He signaled that many practitioners didn't uphold the rules of science and that the institution as a whole was at risk as a result. Now, various reincarnations of that type of concern have then emerged, reappeared when sociologists and critical scholars of science articulated ideal institutional norms for science, like Merton, also invited more attention to the norms in ethics, Simon. And then there's a cluster of activity in biomedicine and life sciences and psychology that you also pointed out this morning, that increasingly got concerned with, well, what's wrong with their own fields and what needs to be repaired. That resulted in a long series of calls to action. When we zoom out a little bit, we start to see that all these calls to action had and are having slightly different priorities. Babbage, Merton, Simon were really fixated on the internal structures of science with not so very clear boundaries. Many others expanded what was seen as a need of support, how science made knowledge, but also how that was affecting the world in terms of risk, pollution, structural inequalities, and even war. Now, we think we see, when you look at today's reform movements, the contours of at least two movements, and we argue that both of them are activist, even though the former seems remarkably less so. So both movements sought to change how science works, but also prioritize different value systems. Both of them contributed to what we now call the scientific reform movement, but the elements that they contribute are very different in line with their own priorities. We group them under the label of virtue and equity. And we try to argue that, well, these scientific reform proposals have a couple of interesting parallels to the concerns that early Protestants had, and also to the solutions that they offered. and that in both cases, the concerns and proposed solutions are quite diverse and fall apart into two valuation regimes. We draw here on French pragmatic sociology. So an order of worth framework, a higher order set of principles that structure social settings, and in which each order of worth is characterized by its own logic and its own set of values. And we articulate two, as I said, the virtue regime and the equity regime. And within that virtue regime, you have things like responsibility for high quality science is the promotion of individual virtues. Reform is being tasked with raising awareness or with bureaucratically enforcing virtues. And good science is the responsibility of virtuous individuals. And key notions are conduct, behavior, integrity, and method. But within that equity regime, which also has a long history, but that is more about signaling underrepresentation of specific voices, structural inaccessibility of scientific culture to some, active dismissal of others. So whether under the heading of gatekeeping or epistemic justice or diversity and inclusivity, here something like open science looks very different. It's more about continuing to expand existing emancipatory programs, supporting equity, thinking about who is and isn't included in asking certain types of questions and about openness in that respect. Of course, the reality is much more messy, so this is also a bit of an exaggeration into these two orders, which don't really have clear-cut boundaries. But if you're okay with some blatant generalization, this virtue regime seems to be connected to understandings about science as part of a more globalized competitive market in a kind of a promised land in which we also all work transparently with interoperable data, communication infrastructures, whereas the equity regime seems to see science as a vehicle for recognizing more localities and promoting a global community. Now, and then we in the paper go into 5 domains where parallels between the two moral programs could offer lessons with respect to the content and direction of the programs. Of course, I don't have time to go into all 5. Maybe I can do 1 or 2. So these are about how the regimes prioritize amongst individuals and or institutions, and whether one can actually trust scientists or believers or not, and the question of whose voices actually matter. Now, in virtue-based moral programs of reform and reformation, we think we see that the quality of convictions, the trust in God, or in the appropriateness of methods and procedure are rooted in individual moral character. Virtue-based reforms in science, echoing Margaret Thatcher here, there's no such thing as society. They place the responsibility with individuals and frequently under the banner of scientific integrity, even to the point that they understand scientific institutions and also cultures as little more than a set of individuals. Distrust in institutions here is quite high. So for instance, scientific publishers, but also universities are seen as potentially corrupting individuals' abilities to act in accordance to, for instance, proper procedure by how their governance processes are structured and how they also target outcomes, and certain operationalizations like reproducibility might fit here into this box. Equity-based moral programs of reform and reformation work to dismantle systems of oppression that are being held responsible for structural inequalities. In science, I think a good example is the way in which the UNESCO recommendation on open science focuses on much more than open access. It is also focusing on building institutions that allow more and other people to participate. How am I doing on time? Should I skip that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much more? Yeah, I would say 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that should work. I'll go here. So in the Reformation, Mara taught us there was also a lot of disagreement about rules, and this resulted in also a proliferation of different types of churches in a very plural landscape of processes and protocols that each believed that they had the final say about proper worship. And in the quest for good science, we also see a virtue program that prescribes a set of rules. And these rules are encoded in tools and also in methods, but above all else in a certain type of philosophy of science that might do a bit of a similar thing. Enlighten a particular road to certified knowledge. And the need for a new set of rules was framed in the context of a huge scandal. We talked about it over the break that happened in psychology, for instance. Accusations of corruption and fraud, of all kinds of things you shouldn't do. A strong and convincing narrative of crisis and decline triggered a lot of the reform movements that we see today. And there might be a parallel with, and you can maybe say that we got this wrong or complement this story, with the protest against the inner workings of the institutions of Catholicism, which has also been historically cast as the surprise reveal of institutional corruption. But both are politically opportune framings, basically, of moral panic to garner support. Reform initiatives are of all times. So is the knowledge of imperfect institutions. So where the virtue program frames this as novelty, panic and scandal in order to push radical change, equity programs stress continuity and also seek to continue existing democratization processes. The pursuit of radical change on the one hand, or the continuity and democratization on the other, we think leads to a different prioritization of voices in the communities at stake. A focus on optimization, for instance, by focusing on rules, by focusing on their implementation, that invites top-down processes and maybe also implementation of policies that place power to articulate change in the hands of a select few, and the focus on optimization by way of continuous democratization does something different, because it tries to expand the number of voices that get to say in making the future of a church or of science. It's actually something that some of you know this book maybe, that Helen Longino pointed out in her book on science as social knowledge, where she offers the epistemic arguments basically to locate objectivity in community. So these types of arguments form the basis to expand calls for diversity and inclusion, and not just for justice, but also for epistemic reasons. A more diverse community can also cover and include and balance against one another inside and outside threats to the validity of knowledge that they produce. So what we're of course not claiming is that scientific reform is the mirror image of the Reformation, and there's no such thing as that too, or that we expect religious wars to pave the future for science, but you never know these days. But we're really hoping to show the moral concern and the moral program that gave rise to both movements, and how they're rooted in discontent with institutions and distrust of the capacity also of institutions and individuals' capacities to do the right thing. And the implicit, but also we think really powerful connotation is that virtues require surveillance, and that individuals are the relevant unit for understanding science, and that many but not all institutions are standing in our way. And what is also striking, we think, is how both scientific reform and reformation shift authority, and how this opens up different ways of doing participation and also different ways of doing gatekeeping. So the equity and virtue regimes, especially how they are institutionalized, are each professing a different route, a different goal for good science. And this can and does really sometimes also polarize discussions, because the answers to the questions of how to do excellent science, to build community or support process, organize trusts, is really dependent on how we assign worth and value. So this is why we argue that reform debates need to make these moral programs visible, and not just by identifying their values, but also by legitimizing why these values deserve priority in this context, and by allowing discussion about that legitimacy.
All right, thank you so much. We're a little scheduled, so let's do 1 or 2 questions, and then if there are further questions, just move that on into